Whispers from the Storm, a collection of horror tales. The rain falls heavily against the glass. Each drop races down the window, leaving trails like tears on the cold surface. The world outside is a blur of gray and shadow. Lightning flashes in the distance, illuminating the darkness for just a moment before plunging everything back into shadow. The perfect night for tales that chill the blood and make the heart race. Stories of things that lurk in the darkness, waiting. Listening, hunting. As the storm rages outside, let these whispers guide you through the darkness. But remember, once heard, they cannot be unheard. Some stories stay with you long after the telling is done. Story 1. The 13th floor in the Westfield building on 5th Avenue. The elevator buttons skip from 12 to 14. Most assume it's superstition, a common practice in many high-rises. But Marian Fisher knew better. She'd been the night security guard there for nearly 6 years, and she knew the 13th floor existed. She'd seen it on the building plans, hidden away in the archives. More troubling, she'd heard the elevator stop there, in the dead of night, when the building should have been empty. Tonight, like every night, Marian sat at her desk in the lobby, monitoring the security feeds. Outside, rain lashed against the windows, occasional thunder shaking the glass. The storm had driven most people home early, leaving the building eerily quiet. At 11:47 p.m., the elevator on the far right began to move. Marian watched the indicator lights. The car was descending from the 20th floor. It stopped at 18, then 15, then, impossibly, at 13. Marian's breath caught in her throat. She switched to the elevator camera feed, expecting to see an empty car. Instead, she saw a man in a dark suit, his back to the camera. He stood perfectly still, facing the closed doors. The elevator remained at the 13th floor for exactly 3 minutes before continuing its descent. Marian's hands trembled as she watched the indicator lights. 1412, down to the lobby. When the doors opened, the elevator was empty. Marian reviewed the footage immediately. The man had vanished somewhere between the 13th floor and the lobby, but that wasn't possible. The elevator hadn't stopped again. The next night, it happened again, and the night after, always at 11:47 p.m., always stopping at the 13th floor, always a man in a dark suit whose face she never saw. After a week of this, Marian made a decision. She would ride the elevator herself, press every button, and prove to herself that there was no 13th floor. Just a gap in the numbers and her imagination running wild. At 11:40 p.m., Marian stepped into the elevator. She pressed the button for the top floor, determined to ride all the way down, stopping at every floor. As the doors closed, the lights flickered briefly. The elevator began its ascent. When it reached the top floor, Marian took a deep breath and pressed the button for the floor below. Floor by floor, she descended. 2019, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14. As the elevator passed the 14th floor, it shuddered violently. The lights flickered again, and Marian felt a sickening lurch as the car seemed to drop faster than it should. The indicator light now showed 13. The elevator had stopped. Marian's heart pounded in her chest. This was impossible. There was no button for the 13th floor. The doors shouldn't open, but they did. Beyond the doors was darkness. Not the darkness of an unlit floor, but a complete absence of light that seemed to swallow the dim glow from the elevator. Cold air rushed in, carrying a smell like wet earth and something else, something rotten. Marian backed against the rear wall of the elevator. From the darkness, she heard shuffling footsteps approaching. A figure appeared at the threshold, a man in a dark suit. He stood with his back to her, just as she'd seen on the camera. Slowly, the man began to turn. Marian lunged for the control panel, frantically pressing the lobby button. The doors remained open. The man continued to turn, gradually revealing his profile. His skin was gray and sagging, as if it had been underwater for too long. Just as the man's face came into view, the elevator plunged into darkness. Marian screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. She felt cold hands grip her shoulders, pulling her forward into the darkness. The next morning, the day security guard found the elevator, stopped at the lobby, its doors open. Inside was a dark suit jacket, neatly folded. Of Marian Fisher, there was no sign. The security footage showed Marian entering the elevator at 11:40 p.m. The camera caught her descending, floor by floor. At 11:47, the feed went dark for exactly 3 minutes. When it returned, the elevator was empty. In the Westfield building, the elevator buttons still skipped from 12 to 14. Skip, but sometimes, late at night, when the building is empty and the storm rages outside, the indicator light pauses at a floor that doesn't exist. And if you listen carefully, you might hear the whisper of a woman's voice warning you to never, ever press the button for the 13th floor. Story 2. The roadside reflection Highway 27 stretched endlessly through the Nevada desert, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the barren landscape. Jacob Turner had been driving for 14 hours straight. His only company, the occasional passing truck and the classic rock station that faded in and out of static. The rain had started an hour ago, unusual for this part of the country. It drummed steadily on the roof of Jacob's old Chevy, the wipers struggling to keep the windshield clear. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road just far enough ahead to navigate safely. Jacob checked his watch. 2:17 a.m. He should have stopped at the last motel, but he was determined to reach Las Vegas by morning. Just a few more hours, he told himself. Just a few more hours. The rain intensified, beating against the car like thousands of tiny fists. Jacob leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. The yellow lines of the highway had disappeared beneath the torrent of water. He slowed the car, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. In the distance, a figure appeared at the side of the road. A hitchhiker, Jacob thought, though who would be out in this weather was beyond him. As he drew closer, he saw it was a woman in a pale dress, her hair plastered to her face by the rain. She stood perfectly still, one arm extended, thumb raised in the universal signal for a ride. Jacob had never picked up a hitchhiker before. It wasn't safe, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. Kit, but something about the woman, her stillness, her solitude in the face of the storm made him slow the car. As his headlights fully illuminated her, Jacob froze. The woman's face was his own. Not similar, not a resemblance. It was his face, exact in every detail, from the small scar above his right eyebrow to the 3-day stubble on his chin. Only the eyes were different, black and empty, like holes punched in reality. Jacob's foot slammed on the accelerator. The tires spun on the wet asphalt before finding purchase, and the car lurched forward. In the rearview mirror, he saw the figure standing in the road, watching him drive away. 5 miles later, Jacob's heart still raced. He must have been hallucinating. Too many hours on the road, too little sleep. He turned up the radio, trying to drown out his thoughts with music. Around a bend in the road, his headlights again picked out a figure by the roadside. The same figure. The same dress. The same face, his face. Jacob drove faster, refusing to look as he passed. Miles ticked by on the odometer. The rain continued to fall. When he saw the figure for the third time, Jacob nearly drove off the road. It was standing in the exact center of the highway, forcing him to swerve around it. As he passed, he caught a glimpse of that terrible smile on his own face. The fourth time, the figure was closer to the car. K. The fifth time, it was standing directly beside the road, its arm no longer outstretched but hanging limply at its side. The sixth time, it was running alongside the car, keeping pace impossibly at 60 miles per hour. Jacob was sobbing now, his vision blurred by tears as much as by the rain. He drove blindly, praying for daylight, for a town, for any sign of civilization. The gaslight blinked on. Jacob ignored it. He couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. When the engine finally sputtered and died, Jacob sat gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. The silence was absolute, broken only by the steady drum of rain on the roof. Slowly, Jacob turned to look out the passenger window. There was nothing there, just darkness and rain. He exhaled shakily, allowing himself to believe it was over. Just a hallucination, just his mind playing tricks. Then he looked in the rearview mirror. The back seat was not empty. The figure sat directly behind him, its face, his face visible in the mirror. It smiled, revealing teeth too numerous and too sharp to be human. Its hand, pale and dripping with water, reached forward to touch his shoulder. 3 days later, a state trooper found Jacob Turner's abandoned car on Highway 27. The keys were in the ignition. The gas tank was full, and the driver's side door was wide open. Of Jacob himself, there was no sign. But travelers on Highway 27 report seeing a hitchhiker during rainstorms. A man in wet clothes, his face obscured by shadow, thumb raised in the universal signal for a ride. Those who slow down enough report a strange phenomenon. The hitchhiker's face looks exactly like their own. None who stop for him are ever seen again. Story 3. The photograph album Elizabeth Mercer had always been close to her grandmother, Margaret. K. When the old woman passed away at 94, Elizabeth was devastated but not surprised. Margaret had been failing for months, her mind slipping away long before her body. The reading of the will was straightforward. Margaret had left her modest savings to be split among her 3 grandchildren. Her personal effects were to be divided up as they saw fit, with one exception. Her photograph album was to go to Elizabeth. Elizabeth remembered the album well. As a child, she had spent hours poring over the black and white images with her grandmother, listening to stories of people long dead, family history preserved in silver gelatin prints. After the funeral, Elizabeth took the album home. It was a heavy thing, bound in cracked leather, its pages thick with photographs dating back to the 1920s. She set it on her coffee table but didn't open it immediately. Grief was still too raw. A week later, during a thunderstorm that knocked out the power, Elizabeth lit candles and finally opened the album. The familiar photographs greeted her. Margaret as a young woman, standing proudly in front of the family's first automobile. Margaret and her husband on their wedding day. family picnics and Christmas gatherings. But as Elizabeth turned the pages, she found photographs she didn't recognize. Newer ones, in color, recent ones. There was a photograph of Elizabeth's apartment building, taken from across the street. Another of Elizabeth collecting her mail. Elizabeth walking her dog. Elizabeth sleeping in her bed, her hands trembling. Elizabeth turned the page. There was a photograph of her, sitting on her sofa in the candlelight, looking down at the very album she was holding. The photograph had been taken from the perspective of someone standing in the corner of her living room. The corner where, at this very moment, the shadows seemed unnaturally deep. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she raised her eyes from the album to look at the corner of the room. The shadows moved. Elizabeth heard the click of a camera shutter, saw the brief flash of light. Then darkness claimed her. The police found Elizabeth Mercer's body 3 days later, after neighbors reported a strange smell. She was seated on her sofa, the photograph album open on her lap. The medical examiner couldn't determine a cause of death, noting only that her expression was one of absolute terror. The photograph album was logged as evidence. When the detective assigned to the case examined it, he found it contained only family photographs. From the 1920s through the 1990s, there were no recent color photographs, and certainly none of Elizabeth. On the last page, however, was a single empty space, as if waiting for one final photograph to complete the collection. That night, the detective took home several case files to review, including photographs of Elizabeth's apartment. As the rain pattered against his windows, he studied the image of Elizabeth's body on the sofa, the album open on her lap. It was only after midnight that he noticed something strange about the photograph. In the corner of Elizabeth's living room, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. It appeared to be an old woman, her face obscured, holding what looked like a camera. The detective leaned closer, squinting at the image. As he did, he heard a sound from the dark corner of his own living room. Click. Story 4. The patient in room. 248 St. Catherine's Hospital had stood on the outskirts of town for over a century. Originally built as a sanatorium for tuberculosis patients, it had been converted to a general hospital in the 1950s, the oldest wing. However, remained largely unchanged, a maze of narrow corridors and small rooms with high ceilings and large windows, designed to let in fresh air. Dr. Sarah Chen had been working at St. Catherine's for just under a year. As the newest member of the staff, she often found herself assigned to the old wing, covering night shifts that her colleagues avoided. Tonight was no exception. The storm had knocked out power to parts of the hospital, leaving the old wing running on emergency generators. The lights flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows down the long corridors. At 2 a.m., Sarah was making her rounds when her pager beeped. Room 248 needed attention. She frowned, checking her patient list. Room 248 should be empty. Sarah made her way down the corridor, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor. Room 248 was at the very end, its door closed. As she approached, she heard a faint sound of wet, rattling cough that raised the hairs on the back of her neck. Outside the room, Sarah checked the chart holder. It was empty. She knocked lightly on the door. No response, but the coughing continued. "Hello," Sarah called, pushing the door open. "I'm Dr. Chen." The room was dimly lit by the emergency lights. A figure lay in the bed, covered by a thin sheet. The coughing came again, followed by a whispered word that Sarah couldn't quite make out. Sarah approached the bed, her medical training overriding her unease. "I'm sorry, but I don't have any record of a patient in this room. Can you tell me your name?" The figure shifted slightly. A hand emerged from beneath the sheet-thin, almost skeletal, with long, yellowed nails. It beckoned Sarah closer. Against her better judgment, Sarah leaned in. The coughing had stopped, replaced by a rattling wheeze. The whispered word came again, clearer this time. "Closer." Sarah bent down, her ear near what she assumed was the patient's mouth. The whisper came again, so faint she had to strain to hear it. "It's catching." A hand shot out, gripping Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. The sheet fell away, revealing not a face but a gaping void, a darkness that seemed to swallow the light around it. From within that darkness came a cough, wet, viscous, and directly into Sarah's face. Sarah recoiled, breaking free of the grip and stumbling backward. The figure in the bed sat up, the sheet falling away completely. What it revealed was not human, not anymore. Its body was emaciated, skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Its chest heaved with each labored breath, and where its face should have been was only shadow. Sarah ran. Down the corridor, past the nurse's station, through the double doors that separated the old wing from the new. She didn't stop until she reached the emergency room, bright and busy and normal. The attending physician found nothing wrong with her, despite her insistence that something had been expelled into her face. Her skin was clear, her lungs sounded fine. He suggested stress and lack of sleep, prescribing rest and a day off. Sarah didn't argue. She went home, showered for nearly an hour, and fell into an exhausted sleep. She awoke to the sound of coughing her own. Her chest felt tight, her throat raw. In the bathroom mirror, her reflection looked pale, shadows under her eyes. She told herself it was just a cold, just stress, nothing to do with room 248. But as the day progressed, the cough worsened. By evening, she was bringing up thick, dark phlegm. Her skin felt hot and tight, as if it had shrunk in the wash. When night fell, Sarah found herself standing in front of her bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection. Was it her imagination, or had her face begun to change? Her cheekbones seemed more pronounced, her eyes deeper set. By morning, there was no denying it. Sarah's face was transforming, the flesh seeming to recede, pulling tight across her skull. Her cough had become the same wet, rattling sound she had heard in room 248. Sarah called in sick. Then she called Dr. Wilson, the oldest physician at St. Catherine's. When he heard where she had been, he fell silent for a long moment. "Room 248, he finally said, his voice hushed. "That room has been sealed off for decades." He told her a story then about the early days of the sanatorium, about a strain of tuberculosis so virulent it had killed within days, about the patient who had been quarantined in room 248, a patient whose body had never been claimed, whose name had been lost to time. Day had found the attending physician dead in the room as well, his face unrecognizable, his lungs filled with fluid. "But that's impossible," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. "I was in that room last night." "Doctor." Wilson was silent again. Then, "Stay where you are. I'm coming over." But by the time he arrived, Sarah was gone. Her apartment was empty, the front door standing open. strewn on her bathroom mirror. Written in what appeared to be thick, dark phlegm were 3 words: "It's catching. Run." Sarah Chen was never found. Her disappearance was attributed to mental breakdown. Her descriptions of room 248 dismissed as delusions. St. Catherine's Hospital closed the following year. The official reason was budget cuts, but staff whispered of other causes, of lights that came on in room 248 during storms, of a wet, rattling cough echoing down empty corridors, of glimpses of a doctor making her rounds in the old wing, her face hidden in shadow. They whispered, too, of the cough that spread among those who had seen her, a cough that started mild but grew worse, a cough that came with fever and altered features and, eventually, disappearance. It's said that if you stand outside the abandoned hospital during a storm, you can hear it still, the cough from room 248. Those who hear it fall ill within days. It's catching, you see, and it's spreading. Story 5. The echo chamber professor Richard Dalton had dedicated his life to the study of acoustics. His research on echo phenomena had earned him acclaim in academic circles, though few outside those circles understood his work. His latest project, however, transcended traditional acoustics. Richard had become obsessed with what he called temporal echoes, sounds that, theoretically, could travel not just through space but through time. The university had denied his requests for funding, calling his proposals pseudo-scientific. Undeterred, Richard had converted his basement into a laboratory, spending his life savings on equipment that lined the walls. Speakers, microphones, oscilloscopes, and custom-built devices whose functions only he understood. At the center of the room stood his masterpiece, the echo chamber, a perfect sphere constructed of specialized materials designed to trap and amplify sound waves to unprecedented levels. Richard believed that at the right frequency and amplitude, sound could create ripples in the fabric of space-time itself, allowing him to hear voices from the past or the future. Tonight, with the storm raging outside, conditions were perfect. The barometric pressure, the electromagnetic interference from the lightning awl would enhance the chamber's capabilities. Richard sealed himself inside the sphere, the heavy door closing with a soft hiss. The interior was padded with acoustic foam, the walls embedded with hundreds of tiny microphones and speakers. At the center was a single chair and a control panel. He began with a simple tone, a pure A at 440 Hz. Through his headphones, he heard it bounce around the chamber, returning slightly altered with each reflection. He adjusted the frequency minutely, watching the waveforms on the small monitor before him. For 3 hours, he worked methodically, pushing the frequencies higher, then lower, combining tones to create complex interference patterns. The storm outside grew more intense, lightning striking closer to the house. Each thunderclap registered on his instruments, the vibrations adding variables to his experiment. At precisely 11:42 p.m., Richard found it a harmonic convergence that caused his equipment to behave in ways he had only theorized. The waveforms on his monitor twisted into patterns he'd never seen before. Through his headphones came a sound like rushing water, punctuated by static and what sounded like distant voices. Richard increased the amplitude, his heart racing. The voices became clearer fragments of conversations, laughter, weeping. They overlapped and intertwined, hundreds, perhaps thousands of voices speaking in languages both familiar and unknown. Then, gradually, the cacophony resolved into a single voice, A woman, her words unclear but her tone urgent, pleading. Richard adjusted his equipment, trying to isolate her voice from the background noise. "Can't stay here." The voice faded in and out. "Coming through danger." Richard pressed a button on his control panel, recording the voice. He would analyze it later, decipher its message. For now, he needed to maintain the harmonic convergence to keep the temporal window open. "Hello," he called out. "Can you hear me?" The rushing sound grew louder. The voice came again, clearer now. "Richard, Richard Dalton, you need to shut it down. It's coming through." Richard froze. How did it know his name? "What's coming through?" he asked. "Who are you?" "Elizabeth Dalton," the voice replied. "Your great-granddaughter. The date is September 17th, 2097. You need to shut down the echo chamber now. It's creating a pathway." "A pathway for what?" Richard asked, his scientific curiosity overriding his shock. The rushing sound had become a roar, like a waterfall, or more disturbing, like the sound of something massive moving through a confined space. "We call it the whisper," Elizabeth's voice said, now barely audible above the roar. "It lives between moments, between seconds. It whispers to us in our dreams, in the static between radio stations, in the white noise of empty rooms. It's ancient and patient and hungry, and you're giving it a way in." Richard's hand hovered over the power switch. "This is impossible," he said. "Sis, this defies all known physics. The physics you know is incomplete," Elizabeth's voice said. "Please, there isn't much time. It's already sensed the opening." It's already her voice cut off abruptly, replaced by a different sound, low, sibilant whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Richard couldn't make out words, but the sound filled him with a primal dread. He reached for the power switch, but his hand stopped inches away. Not because he hesitated, but because he couldn't move it any further. Some force was holding him in place. The whispering grew louder, resolving into a single repeated phrase. "At last, at last, at last." Richard tried to scream, but no sound emerged. The air in the chamber had become thick, resistant, as if time itself was congealing around him. Through the small window in the chamber door, he saw a darkness spreading across his laboratory, not the absence of light, but something more fundamental, as if reality itself was being unwritten. The darkness reached the echo chamber, seeping through the sealed door like smoke. It filled the chamber, surrounding Richard, entering his mouth, his nose, his ears. As consciousness faded, he heard one final whisper. "Thank you for the invitation, Professor." "I've been so very hungry for so very long." When the storm passed and the morning came, Richard's wife found the basement laboratory in perfect order. The echo chamber stood at its center, sealed and silent. There was no sign of her husband, nor any indication of where he had gone. The police investigation revealed nothing. Richard Dalton had simply vanished. His equipment was examined by university colleagues, who found nothing unusual, just an elaborate acoustic experiment. Interesting but hardly revolutionary. Only one detail puzzled them. The recording device in the echo chamber had been running. It contained 7 hours of silence, followed by 3 minutes of what sounded like rushing water and static. And at the very end, barely audible, a whisper. "Who's next?" Story 6. The mirror twin Emma had always felt like half of a whole. This wasn't merely a philosophical stance. She had been born a twin, Her sister Olivia had died at birth, a fact Emma had known since she was old enough to understand. Growing up, Emma had created an elaborate fantasy world where Olivia still lived, an invisible companion who knew her thoughts, shared her secrets, and never left her side. Her parents had indulged this, seeing it as a child's way of processing loss. But as Emma entered her teens, they grew concerned when the imaginary relationship didn't fade. They sent her to therapists who diagnosed everything from prolonged grief to schizophrenia. They prescribed medications that made Emma feel hollow. None of them understood the truth. Olivia was real. Emma could feel her, sense her presence, especially in moments of solitude. By her 27th birthday, Emma had learned to keep Olivia a secret. She lived alone in a small apartment, worked remotely as a graphic designer, and spoke to her sister only when no one else was around. It was a lonely existence, but a peaceful one, until the mirrors began to change. It started subtly. Emma would catch glimpses of movement in her bathroom mirror, movement that didn't correspond to her own. A hand raised when hers was lowered. Smile when her face was serious. She blamed it on stress, on lack of sleep, on the new medication her latest therapist had prescribed. But the discrepancies grew more pronounced. One morning, Emma stood brushing her teeth, and her reflection lowered its toothbrush and stared at her, not mirroring her, but watching her, head slightly tilted, eyes curious. Emma dropped her toothbrush and backed away. Her reflection did not. It stayed perfectly still, lips curving into a gentle smile. "Olivia," Emma whispered. The reflection nodded. Emma fled the bathroom, heart pounding. She called in sick to work and spent the day avoiding every reflective surface in her apartment. But curiosity eventually overcame fear, and as night fell, she forced herself to return to the bathroom mirror. Her reflection was there, normal again, mimicking her movements exactly. Emma exhaled, telling herself it had been a hallucination, a symptom of skipping her medication. Then her reflection spoke, its lips moving independently of her own. "Hello, sister." Emma's scream caught in her throat. She spun away, covering her face with her hands. "Don't be afraid," her reflection said, voice muffled by Emma's hands over her ears. "I've been trying to reach you for so long." Slowly, Emma lowered her hands and turned back to the mirror. Her reflection. Olivia smiled at her. "How is this possible?" Emma asked. "I've always been here," Olivia replied. "In the space between watching you, waiting for you to see me. The space between worlds, between life and death. I've been trapped here since we were separated. But now I've found a way back." Over the next few days, Emma spent hours in conversation with her sister. Olivia explained that the boundaries between their worlds were thinning. Soon, she said, they could be reunited properly. All Emma had to do was help her cross over. "How?" Emma asked. "The next time there's a storm," Olivia said, "the energy will create a doorway. All reflective surfaces become permeable then. You just need to reach through and pull me across." Emma waited anxiously for the forecast to predict rain. When at last the storms came, rolling in just after midnight, Emma stood before her bathroom mirror, palms pressed against the glass. On the other side, Olivia mirrored her pose, their hands aligned. "Now," Olivia whispered, "push with all your strength." Emma pressed against the mirror. To her amazement, the surface yielded like a membrane, stretching inward. She pushed harder, feeling it thin and weaken beneath her palms. Suddenly, her hands broke through, plunging into icy coldness. Before she could react, Olivia's hands gripped her wrists and pulled. Emma felt herself being dragged forward, her face pressing against the mirror's surface. It stretched around her features like plastic wrap, making it impossible to breathe. She tried to scream, to pull back, but Olivia's grip was inhumanly strong. "Don't fight it, sister," Olivia hissed, her voice no longer gentle. "I've waited too long for this." With a final, vicious yank, Olivia pulled Emma through the mirror. As she passed through, Emma caught a glimpse of the space between, an endless gray void populated by shifting shadows and half-formed figures. Faces pressed against invisible barriers, mouths open in silent screams. Then she was through, stumbling into what looked exactly like her bathroom, but reversed. Everything was in the wrong place, text backwards on bottles and tubes. And standing before her, still gripping her wrists, was her own face, no Olivia's face, now solid and real and smiling with too many teeth. "Thank you, sister," Olivia said, releasing Emma's wrists. "You have no idea how long I've been trapped in that place." "What is this?" Emma asked, rubbing her wrists. "What have you done?" "A simple exchange," Olivia replied. "You take my place, I take yours. Fair, isn't it? After all, it was meant to be me who lived. I was the stronger one." "No," Emma whispered, lunging for the mirror. But her hands met solid glass. On the other side, Olivia waved mockingly. "Don't waste your energy," she called, her voice muffled. "The doorway only opens during storms, and only when I allow it. This is your home now. The space between... Perhaps in time, you'll find another poor soul to help you escape. But I wouldn't count on it." Single quotes. Emma watched helplessly as Olivia, wearing her face, her life, turned and walked away. The bathroom lights switched off, leaving Emma alone in the darkness of the mirror world. In the weeks that followed, Emma learned the cruel truth of her new existence. The mirror world was a perfect replica of her own, but lifeless and cold. Food had no taste. Water didn't quench her thirst. Sleep never came, and she was not alone. Shadows moved in the corners of her vision, other trapped souls, other victims of exchanges. They never spoke, never showed themselves clearly, but she could feel their resentment, their hunger. Now, when storms come, Emma stands before the mirror that was once her own. Sometimes she catches glimpses of her old apartment, of Olivia living her life, wearing her clothes, calling her parents, smiling with Emma's mouth. And sometimes, when someone new moves into the apartment, Emma sees them standing before the mirror. She places her palms against the glass and smiles gently. It's a waiting game now. Sooner or later, curiosity will win. After all, everyone wonders, at least once, if their reflection might move independently. If that movement in the mirror might be something more than imagination. And when they do, Emma will be waiting. Palms pressed against the glass. Smile, gentle and inviting. "Hello," she whispered. "I've been trying to reach you for so long." Story 7. The silent room, the Carson Hotel, had stood in the center of town for over 100 years. Its Victorian architecture and ornate facade, an elegant reminder of a bygone era. When David Newman checked in for a 3-night stay, he expected quaint charm and perhaps some creaky floorboards. What he didn't expect was room 312. The hotel clerk had seemed hesitant when assigning him the room, her fingers hovering over the key before finally handing it over with a tight smile. "It's one of our finest rooms," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. Very quiet. David didn't think much of it at the time. He was in town for a conference, and all he wanted was a comfortable bed and some peace and quiet to prepare his presentation. Room 312 promised both, with its queen-sized four-poster bed and location at the end of a long corridor, far from the elevator and ice machine. The first thing David noticed upon entering was the silence. Not just quiet, but a complete absence of sound. The door closed behind him with no audible click. His footsteps on the hardwood floor made no noise. When he set his suitcase down, it landed with visible impact but produced no sound. David cleared his throat. Nothing. He spoke aloud. "Hello." His lips moved. His vocal cords vibrated, but no sound reached his ears. Unnerved, he moved to the window and opened it. Outside, rain was falling steadily, cars passing on the wet street below. He could see it all, but heard nothing. Not the rain, not the traffic, not the pedestrians with their umbrellas hurrying along the sidewalk. David closed the window and reached for his phone. He dialed his wife's number, pressing the phone to his ear. It rang. He could feel the vibration, but he couldn't hear it. When she answered, he saw her name appear on the screen, but her voice was absent. He spoke quickly, explaining the strange phenomenon, but couldn't tell if she heard him or was even still on the line. After a minute, the call ended. David went to the door, determined to speak with management about changing rooms. When he grasped the handle, it refused to turn. He pulled harder, then pushed his full weight against the door. It didn't budge. Panic rising, David returned to the window. It too was now sealed shut, the latch fused as if welded. He considered breaking the glass, but something stopped him, an irrational fear that the silence might spill out into the world beyond. As night fell outside, David tried to stay calm. He turned on the television, watching the pictures move across the screen in mute pantomime. He ran water in the bathroom sink, watching it splash without sound. He even struck the wall with his fist, feeling the impact jar his bones, but hearing nothing. Exhausted, David finally lay down on the bed, not bothering to undress. Sleep seemed impossible in the unnatural silence, but eventually his eyes grew heavy. He woke to darkness and the unsettling feeling of being watched. The digital clock on the nightstand showed 3:17 a.m., its red numbers the only light in the room. David lay perfectly still, eyes searching the darkness. There was something in the corner of the room. A deeper darkness, a shape that hadn't been there when he'd fallen asleep. As his eyes adjusted, he could make out a figure, human in general outline, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, its proportions subtly distorted. David wanted to shout, but what was the point? No sound could exist in this room. He watched, paralyzed, as the figure began to move toward the bed, its movements jerky and unnatural, like stop-motion animation, missing frames. As it drew closer, David could see more details. Its skin was pale gray, stretched too tight over an elongated face. Its eyes were solid black, reflecting the red glow of the clock. Its mouth was open in what might have been a smile or a scream. The figure reached the foot of the bed and slowly raised a long, thin finger to where lips should have been, in the universal gesture for silence. David tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. He was as frozen as the silence around him. The figure crawled onto the bed, its movements fluid now, like a spider climbing its web. It loomed over him, its face inches from his own, its breath somehow. It had breath cold against his skin. Its mouth moved, forming words David couldn't hear. It reached out, placing its palm flat against his chest, directly over his heart. David felt a cold sensation spreading from the point of contact, creeping through his veins like ice water. The figure's mouth stretched wider, impossibly wide, unhinged like a snake's jaw. No sound emerged, but David understood suddenly what it wanted, what the silence wanted. It was hungry. Somehow, David broke free of his paralysis. He rolled sideways off the bed, hitting the floor hard. The figure followed, reaching for him with those impossibly long fingers. David scrambled across the floor, seeking escape where there was none. In desperation, he grabbed the desk lamp and hurled it at the window. The lamp sailed through the air in absolute silence, striking the glass with visible force. For a moment, nothing happened. Then cracks appeared, spreading outward like a spiderweb. The figure froze, its head turning toward the window. Its expression changed from hunger to alarm. It lurched toward the window, arms outstretched as if to prevent what was happening. Too late. The glass shattered, fragments suspended briefly in air before falling to the floor. Still no sound, but David felt a shift in pressure, as if a vacuum seal had been broken. The figure whirled back toward David, its face contorted in silent rage. It lunged, but at that moment, sound rushed back into the world like a physical force. David heard the rain outside, the distant wail of a siren, the hum of the heating system coming to life. And he heard the figures scream a sound like feedback from a microphone, high-pitched and painful. It clutched at its head, body convulsing. Then, between one blink and the next, it was gone, leaving nothing but a lingering chill in the air. David didn't wait. He ran to the door, which now opened easily, and fled down the corridor. At the front desk, a different clerk listened to his breathless account with surprising calmness. "I'm very sorry about your experience, Mr. Newman," she said when he finished. "Squee, we can certainly move you to a different room." "I don't want a different room," David said. "I want to check out, now." The clerk nodded, tapping at her computer. "Of course, though you should know." She paused, looking up at him with eyes that suddenly seemed too dark, too deep. "The silence has marked you now. It knows your sound, your voice." David backed away from the desk, heart pounding. "It might be decades," the clerk continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But eventually, you'll find another silent room. And this time, you won't escape." David fled the hotel, drove through the night, and never returned to that town. He told himself the clerk's words were just a threat, just a final attempt to frighten an already terrified guest. But sometimes, when he's alone, he hears it or rather, doesn't hear it. A pocket of silence, a moment when the world's sounds simply stop. It never lasts more than a second or two, but it's enough to remind him. The silence is patient. The silence is hungry, and it remembers his voice. Story 8. The borrowed time. Thomas Whitman had always been precise. As a watchmaker by trade, precision was not just a skill but a philosophy. His small shop in the heart of the city was a testament to his craftsmanship. Shelves lined with timepieces of all kinds, from antique pocket watches to modern chronometers, each one keeping perfect time. Thomas took particular pride in his personal collection of rare and unusual watches. The prize of his collection was a pocket watch he'd discovered at an estate sale. Its case made of tarnished silver, its face unmarked by any manufacturer's name. The watch had 12 normal hours marked in Roman numerals, but also a smaller dial that counted down from 60 to 0. When Thomas had first wound it, the smaller dial had stood at 60. Curious, he had watched as it began to count down, one mark at a time, synchronized with the second hand. When it reached 0, it had reset itself to 60 and begun again. A timer, Thomas had thought. Nothing unusual. But he'd soon discovered the watch's strange property. When the dial counted down, time itself seemed to slow around him. He'd first noticed it while crossing the street. A car had come speeding around the corner, bearing down on him with no time for him to react. Thomas had braced for impact, and in that moment, felt the watch grow warm in his pocket. When he'd looked up, the car was still approaching, but moving as if through molasses, giving him ample time to step aside. Once safely on the sidewalk, time had resumed its normal flow, the car accelerating to its natural speed. Over the weeks that followed, Thomas had experimented. He'd learned that by holding the watch and concentrating, he could control the effect, slowing time around him while he moved at normal speed. The countdown dial, he discovered, measured how much borrowed time he had left a minute of normal time in which he could manipulate the flow of seconds. Thomas used this power sparingly, instinctively understanding that there must be a cost. He saved a child from falling down a flight of stairs. He prevented a mugging in the alley behind his shop. Small interventions, using just seconds of his borrowed time. The watch always reset itself to 60 afterward, ready for the next emergency. Then came the night of the storm. Thomas was working late, repairing an intricate anniversary clock, when he heard a crash from the front of his shop. Looking up, he saw 3 men in dark clothing, their faces obscured by masks. One had smashed the display window, while the others were grabbing watches from the broken display. Without thinking, Thomas reached for the silver pocket watch. Holding it firmly, he concentrated, feeling the familiar sensation of time stretching around him. The robbers' movements became sluggish, their voices dropping too deep, unintelligible growls. Thomas moved quickly to his desk, retrieving the handgun he kept locked in the bottom drawer. Time was still flowing slowly as he approached the first robber, pressing the gun against his back. He allowed time to normalize, watching the man stiffen as he became aware of the weapon. "Put everything down," Thomas said, his voice steady, "and tell your friends to do the same." Instead of complying, the man whirled around, knocking the gun from Thomas's hand. His companions turned, one brandishing a knife. Thomas reached for the watch again, but it slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor. Time slowed once more, but differently. This time, Thomas was caught in the effect as well, his movements as treacle as those of the robbers. The watch lay on the floor between them, its smaller dial spinning rapidly backward, past 0, into negative numbers. The air grew thick, resistant, like moving through water. One of the robbers, moving with painful slowness, reached for Thomas with a hand that seemed to leave trails in the air. Thomas tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't respond properly. It was like a nightmare where running is impossible. school. The watch's dial spun faster, its negative numbers climbing. 10, -20, -30, as the numbers increased. Thomas felt a drawing sensation, as if something essential was being pulled from him. His vision dimmed at the edges, tunneling down to just the watch and its spinning dial. With supreme effort, Thomas managed to move his foot, kicking the watch across the floor. It struck the wall and stopped, the dial freezing at -43. Time snapped back to normal speed with such violence that Thomas was thrown to the floor. The robbers seemed equally disoriented, staggering and clutching their heads. One fell to his knees, retching. Another collapsed entirely, unconscious or worse. Thomas's vision swam, dark spots dancing before his eyes. He felt ancient, drained, as if he'd run a marathon without training. With trembling hands, he retrieved the watch from where it had landed. The dial had reset, but not 260. It now read 17 and was not counting down. Thomas felt the difference immediately. Where before he'd felt healthy, vital, now his chest ached with each breath. His hands, once surgeon steady, trembled visibly. His reflection in a broken display case showed the face aged beyond its years, hair grayer, lines deeper, eyes sunken. The watch had taken its payment for the borrowed time. In the days that followed, as the police investigated the attempted robbery, Thomas's health declined rapidly. Doctors were baffled by his sudden aging, by the failure of his organs for no apparent cause. They spoke of rare conditions, of stress responses, of genetic anomalies. Thomas knew better. He kept the watch with him always, watching the dial remain fixed at 17. 17 what? Days, hours, years. He couldn't be sure, but he felt the countdown in his bones, in the labored beating of his heart. On the 17th day after the robbery, Thomas sat in his shop, now closed indefinitely due to his health. Rain lashed against the repaired display window. The street outside was empty, sensible people taking shelter from the storm. Thomas held the watch in his palm, studying its unmarked face, the frozen dial. He had accepted his fate, had made his peace. But as lightning flashed, illuminating the watch's silver case, Thomas noticed something he hadn't seen before, tiny engraving on the back, worn nearly smooth with age. Squinting, he made out the words, "Time borrowed must be time repaid." As understanding dawned, the watch's dial finally moved, ticking down to 16, then 15, counting toward 0 with the same inexorable rhythm as the second hand. Thomas smiled faintly. He had borrowed time, and now time had borrowed from him. But perhaps the debt could be settled differently. He closed his eyes, concentrating as he had when slowing time, but with a different intention. Instead of taking, he offered. Instead of borrowing, he gave. Willingly, freely, he directed his remaining years, his precious time, into the watch. The dial spun rapidly, numbers blurring. Thomas felt the years flowing out of him, his body aging decades in minutes. But he also felt something else, a lightness, a release. When the watch's dial finally stopped at 0, Thomas Whitman was gone. His body remained aged beyond recognition, but Thomas himself had become part of the borrowed time, merged with the very fabric of seconds and minutes and hours. And somewhere, a young woman stepping into the path of a speeding car felt time slow around her, giving her the chance to move to safety. A child about to fall from a window suddenly had ample time to regain his balance. A surgeon performing a delicate operation found her hands moving with impossible precision, The patient's failing heart holding out just long enough. Borrowed time, freely given. A watchmaker's final masterpiece. Story 9. The long way home, take the highway. Grace's mother had always said, never the old forest road. No matter how late you're running, no matter how badly you want a shortcut, promise me, Gracie. Grace had promised. For years, she had kept that promise, even when it meant adding 40 minutes to her drive home from college, even when it meant missing the beginning of parties or arriving late for family dinners. The highway was longer, but her mother's fear had been absolute, and Grace had respected it. But tonight was different. Tonight, Grace was not just late, she was in danger of missing her father's 60th birthday party entirely. A jackknifed semi had shut down the highway. Traffic backed up for miles with no movement in over an hour. Rain drummed on the roof of Grace's car, lightning occasionally illuminating the sea of red brake lights stretching ahead. Grace checked the time. 7:42 p.m. The party had started at 7. Her mother had been planning this celebration for months, had made Grace promise repeatedly that she would be there. On time, no excuses. The GPS on her phone offered an alternative route, the old forest road. 22 minutes to her parents' house, versus the 2 hours the highway would take once it reopened. Just this once, Grace whispered, signaling to take the next exit. Sorry, Mom. The old forest road was exactly as Grace remembered from her childhood, narrow. Winding the pavement, cracked and poorly maintained. Ancient trees pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy that blocked what little daylight remained. The rain seemed heavier here, falling in sheets that her wipers struggled to clear. "5 miles in, Grace's headlights illuminated a figure at the side of the road, an elderly woman. Hunched against the rain, thumb extended in the universal gesture for a ride. Grace slowed instinctively, then remembered every warning she'd ever heard about picking up hitchhikers. She began to accelerate past. The woman's eyes caught the headlights, reflecting back gold, like a cat's. Her mouth moved, forming words Grace couldn't hear over the rain. Please. The words seemed to bypass Grace's ears, appearing directly in her mind. Before she could question it, she found herself pulling over, reaching across to open the passenger door. "Thank you, child," the old woman said, sliding into the seat. Water streamed from her clothing, pooling on the floor mat. She smelled of wet earth and something else, something sweet and rotten. Not many stop these days. "The road is lonely now. Where are you headed?" Grace asked, pulling back onto the road. "Same as you," the woman replied. "The end of this road." Grace glanced at her passenger. The woman was older than she'd first appeared, her face a mass of wrinkles so deep they seemed to swallow the shadows. Her clothing was oddly outdated, a dress of heavy wool, a shawl wrapped tight around bony shoulders. "I'm only going as far as Millfield," Grace said. "My parents lived there, as did mine," the woman said. "And there's before them. This road is older than the town, you know. Older than the forest. It was a deer trail first, then a footpath, then a wagon road, always leading to the same place, Millfield," Grace asked, squinting through the windshield. The rain had become a solid wall of water, the road barely visible beyond her headlights. "No," the woman said. "The other place. The place in between." Grace felt the first flutter of unease. "I should focus on driving," she said. The road is treacherous in this weather. Oh yes, the woman agreed. So many accidents on nights like this. So many travelers who never reach their destination. Grace's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Through the rain, she could see a sharp curve ahead. She slowed, taking it carefully. As they rounded the bend, her headlights swept across the trees and, for a moment, illuminated dozens of pale faces watching from between the trunks. Grace gasped, nearly swerving off the road. "You saw them," the woman said, voice suddenly eager. "Most don't, not until it's too late." "What was that?" Grace demanded, heart pounding. "Who were those people?" "Not people," the woman corrected gently. "Not anymore. They were travelers once, like you." They took the forest road when they should have taken the highway. Grace glanced at her phone, mounted on the dashboard. The screen was black. No signal, no GPS, no way to call for help. "I want you to get out," Grace said, voice shaking. "Right now." The old woman laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "Oh, child, I'm not the danger here. I'm the warning. The one chance you have to turn back." "Turn back, where?" "The highway's closed. There's a turnoff half a mile ahead. An old logging road. It takes longer, but it comes out near the bridge. You could still make it to the highway." Grace remembered the logging road from her childhood. Her father had shown it to her once, warning her to never take it. It was barely passable then, likely worse now. But anything seemed better than continuing with this strange woman and those faces in the trees. "And what if I don't take the turnoff?" Grace asked. The woman's expression softened. "Then you'll reach the end of the road, the place where the veil is thin, and you'll join the others, watching and waiting for the next traveler who breaks their promise." Grace's blood ran cold. "What promise?" "The one you made to your mother. Never the old forest road, no matter what." Grace slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the wet pavement, before coming to a stop. "How could you possibly know that?" The old woman's form seemed to flicker in the dim light, like a candle flame in a draft. "Because I made the same promise to my mother, and my mother before her. Some warnings are passed down through generations for good reason." Through the rain, Grace could see the turnoff approaching. A narrow gap in the trees marked by a weathered sign too faded to read. "Last chance, child," the woman said. "The logging road or the forest road." Shoes. Grace made her decision, wrenching the wheel hard. The car bounced and juddered as it left the pavement, tires spinning in mud before finding purchase. The logging road was even narrower than she remembered, barely wide enough for her car, branches scraping against the windows. When she looked over, the passenger seat was empty. The old woman was gone, leaving behind only a small puddle of water and that strange sweet rot smell. Grace drove on, fighting to keep the car on the treacherous road, praying it would indeed lead back to the highway. The storm intensified, wind howling through the trees. Twice, she nearly went off the road entirely, saved only by desperate corrections of the wheel. An hour later, exhausted and shaking, Grace saw lights ahead. The logging road had indeed brought her back to civilization, not the highway, but the outskirts of Millfield itself. When she finally pulled into her parents' driveway, the party was in full swing. Her mother met her at the door, concern etched on her face. "Gracie, we were so worried." "The highway, I know," Grace said, hugging her mother tightly. "I found another way. Her mother held her at arm's length, studying her face. You didn't take the forest road, did you? Grace hesitated, then told the truth. I started to, but then I took the old logging road instead. The color drained from her mother's face. The logging road. Gracie, that road was washed out 10 years ago. It's impassable. Grace felt the world tilt beneath her feet. That's not possible. I just drove it. It was difficult, but come see your father, her mother interrupted, pulling her toward the living room. He's been waiting for you. The celebration continued around Grace, but she moved through it in a daze, accepting hugs and making small talk while her mind raced. After the cake had been cut and the presents opened, she slipped away to her father's study. The old county map was still framed on the wall, just as she remembered. Grace traced the routes with her finger, the highway making its long loop around the forest road cutting directly through, and the logging road. There was no logging road marked on the map. Looking for something, Grace turned to find her father in the doorway, a glass of scotch in his hand. Dad, do you remember showing me the old logging road when I was a kid? Her father frowned. Logging road? No, can't say that I do, but you warned me about it. Said it was dangerous. I warned you about the forest road, he corrected. Never take the forest road, especially after dark. Family rule for generations. Why? Grace asked. The question she'd never thought to ask as a child. What is it about that road? Her father sighed heavily, coming to stand beside her at the map. There are old stories. People disappearing over the years. Cars found abandoned. Some say the road. Train changes at night, especially during storms. Changes how? Becomes longer, begins to loop back on itself, or leads somewhere else entirely. He shrugged, embarrassed. Superstitious nonsense, probably. But why take chances? Grace thought of the old woman, of the faces in the trees, of a road that shouldn't exist but had delivered her safely home. Dad, I need to tell you something. But before she could begin, her phone chimed with a text message. Grace glanced at the screen. An unknown number. The message contained only 4 words. Keep your promise now. Outside. The storm continued. Rain lashing against the windows, and somewhere in the forest, the old road waited, along with those who watched from between the trees, patient, hungry for travelers who break their promises. Story 10. The Stain, the Peterson. Family had been looking for a new home for nearly 6 months, when they finally found the Victorian on Maple Street. The price was surprisingly reasonable for such a large house, especially in this neighborhood. 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms. A spacious attic that could be converted into a home office. It seemed perfect for David, his wife Laura, and their 2 children. There was only one flaw, the stain on the living room ceiling. A dark blotch about 3 feet in diameter, vaguely circular with tendrils extending outward like the legs of a spider. The real estate agent had assured them it was just water damage from a long-repaired roof leak. Nothing structural, nothing dangerous. We can paint over it before you move in, she'd offered, or adjust the price to cover the repair. David had opted for the price adjustment. He could fix it himself. He'd done plenty of home repairs over the years. It would be a simple weekend project. The family moved in on a rainy Tuesday in October. By Friday, David had purchased the supplies to fix the ceiling. Paint, primer, stain-blocking sealer. But each night, he found himself too tired to start the project. The new house seemed to drain his energy, leaving him exhausted by sunset. Laura noticed it too, a heaviness in the air, particularly in the living room, directly beneath the stain. Their son, Alex, was the first to mention the stain's growth. "It's bigger," he said at breakfast on their 5th day in the house, "and darker." David dismissed it as a child's imagination, but that evening, looking up from his armchair, he had to admit Alex was right. The stain had expanded, now closer to 4 feet across. The legs had elongated as well, reaching nearly to the walls. "It's probably just spreading along the ceiling joists," he told Laura when she expressed concern. "Water follows the path of least resistance. I'll take care of it tomorrow." That night, David dreamed of the stain. In his dream, he stood on a ladder, reaching up to touch the discolored ceiling. The surface felt soft, yielding under his fingertips. Warm. When he withdrew his hand, his fingers came away coated in a thick, dark substance that wasn't water at all, but something that moved and writhed against his skin. He woke with a start, heart pounding. The bedroom was dark, but not completely. A faint, pulsing light came from downstairs. David slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Laura, and moved quietly to the hallway. The light emanated from the living room. Standing at the top of the stairs, David could see it, a dim, reddish glow that seemed to come from the stain itself. It pulsed with a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. David descended the stairs slowly, drawn by a curiosity stronger than his fear. In the living room, he looked up at the ceiling and felt his breath catch in his throat. The stain had changed. It was no longer flat against the ceiling, but seemed to bulge downward, as if something heavy and wet pressed against it from above. The edges pulsated with each throb of light. As he watched, a drop formed at the center of the bulge, thick, dark, nearly black in the dim light. It grew slowly, elongating, stretching toward the floor. David stood transfixed, unable to move as the droplet detached and fell. It landed on his forehead with a wet smack, not water. Something warm and viscous that smelled of copper and rot. David gasped, stumbling backward, wiping frantically at his face. His hand came away smeared with what could only be blood. When he looked up again, more droplets were forming, falling faster now. Within seconds, the stain was dripping steadily, blood pattering onto the hardwood floor. David ran, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He burst into the bedroom, shouting for Laura to wake up, to get the children. But the bed was empty. Laura was gone. From down the hall came the sound of the children's door opening. "Laura," David called, moving toward the sound. Alex, Emily. He found them all in the children's bedroom, standing in a tight group, looking up. On the ceiling directly above them was another stain, smaller than the one in the living room, but growing visibly even as David watched. "It's calling to us," Laura said, her voice distant, dreamy. "Can't you hear it? We need to leave," David said, grabbing her arm. "Right now. Get the kids. We're going to a hotel." "But it's raining," Laura replied, still staring at the ceiling. "And it wants us to stay." David looked at his children and felt a chill run through him. They too were staring upward, their expressions blank, eyes reflecting the same pulsing red glow. A drop fell from the new stain, landing on Emily's upturned face. She didn't flinch, didn't wipe it away. Instead, her tongue darted out, licking the blood from her lips. "It tastes like home," she whispered. David's survival instinct finally overcame his shock. He grabbed Emily, scooping her into his arms, and seized Alex's hand. "We're leaving now." Laura made no move to follow as he dragged the children from the room. Alex fought him, small hands clawing, trying to return to the stain. Emily had gone limp in his arms, like a doll with its strings cut. In the hallway, David hesitated, looking back at his wife. "Laura, please." She turned slowly to face him, and David saw with horror that her eyes had changed, the whites now dark, the irises glowing red like the pulsing stain above. "They lived here before us," she said, her voice overlaid with another, deeper sound. "They died here before us. And now they're hungry again." The stain above her burst, raining blood and darker things down upon her. Laura didn't scream, didn't try to escape. She stood with her arms outstretched, face upturned in ecstatic reception as the ceiling collapsed and something came through, something made of shadow and bone and hunger. David ran, down the stairs through the living room where the larger stain had also burst, revealing a gaping hole that pulsed with red light. Blood covered everything now, running down the walls, pooling on the floor, splashing beneath his feet as he carried Emily and dragged the struggling Alex toward the front door. Outside, the rain fell in sheets, instantly soaking them as David pulled his children toward the car. Alex had stopped fighting but moved like a sleepwalker. Emily remained unnaturally still in his arms, her skin cold despite the warm blood that coated her. In the car, David fumbled with his keys, hands slippery with blood and rain. He glanced at the house and felt his heart nearly stop. Every window blazed with that pulsing red light. Silhouettes moved across the glass, human in general shape, but wrong, distorted, jerking and twitching in ways no human body should move. One of them was Laura. What had been Laura? She stood at the living room window, watching him. As their eyes met, she pressed her hand against the glass. The window bulged outward, the glass becoming soft, yielding, stretching like a membrane. Her hand pushed through, then her arm, her face, her body, the glass flowing around her like thick liquid as she emerged from the house. David finally got the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he threw the car into reverse, tires squealing on the wet pavement as he backed out of the driveway. Laroth, the thing that had been Laura and after them, moving with unnatural speed, her body elongating with each step, limbs stretching, mouth opening to reveal rows of teeth where teeth shouldn't be. Day. The last glimpse David had of his home was in the rear-view mirror, the Victorian silhouetted against the night sky. Every window blazing red, the front door open like a mouth, and the figure of his wife standing in the middle of the street, growing smaller as the distance between them increased. 3 days later, a new family came to look at the house on Maple Street. The price had been reduced again, making it an incredible deal for such a beautiful home. The real estate agent pointed out all the features, the spacious rooms, the original woodwork, the large attic perfect for a home office. The only flaw was the stain on the living room ceiling, just a bit of old water damage, nothing serious, nothing structural, nothing dangerous. "We can paint over it before you move in," the agent offered, "or adjust the price to cover the repair." The new family opted for the price adjustment. After all, how hard could it be to fix a little water stain?